Le projet s'intitule Les pratiques culturelles de la conservation de la biodiversité de l'eau Atlas marocain. Je suis chercheur de JDF et MBLA et la liaison entre les chercheurs communautaires et le staff du JDF MBLA.
Good morning, my name is Hugo D'Ambrosio and I'm a consultant for GDF. I am doing the social part of the documentation of cultural practices of conservation in the High Atlas. So the biodiversity side of the project is done by botanists that study the distribution and composition of the botanical repertoire of the region.
One of the important elements of our project in the High Atlas is ex situ conservation. We're talking here about plant enrichment, ex situ conservation of endemic species, endangered, local useful plants and medicinal plants. Because these species are threatened by collection and by overgrazing. So we're trying to grow the species and plant it back to the wild, give it to the local people to use. When the plants are ready, like this lavandula here, we take them and plant them on the wild, on the areas where lavandula grow. This is reintroduction to the wild. This is a lavandula habitat where we're introducing some lavandula here. So the first objective is planting in the wild, reintroduction in the wild. The second objective is distribution of ready species like this to the local population, to the local villages for their own uses, to take the pressure from the wild species.
So in general, we are combining the botanical side of the documentation of the land with how this biodiversity is linked to the communities.
So what we're doing is documenting cultural practices, and we are seeing how practices have changed over time. So what people were doing, what old generations remember, and what's been done now, and we're going to relate that to plant conservation.
We have been training the local community researchers to interview the elders in the community to find out what are the cultural practices of conservation that are still occurring in the area.
بالنسبة لي فاش بديت مع إيغين يلا كنديروا الفريستينغ معهم الأعشاب الطبية والاستعمالات ديالهم شي حاجة ما عجبتنيش في الأول، ولكن مع الخدمة مع إيغين بديت كنكتشف حوايج، يعني الحوايج اللي مهمة بالنسبة للثقافة الأمازيغية خصوصا الجبلية.
And then we also collect anthropological data, how the plants are used, in which context, in which belief system they are used. This documentation allows us to identify plants which are locally important, relevant for local livelihoods. We've collected a lot of data on local use of plants, but not only that, also on local agroecological systems, water management practices, and in general, just traditions that shape the environment in the High Atlas.
Yeah, so we have studied both practices that are occurring in the private land of the people that live here in the High Atlas, and also we have expanded into practices that occur within different communities or even within the same douar.
We've learned a lot and we'll still continue to gather new information about specific plants and specific landscapes that are key to biocultural conservation, such as areas that are managed in a way that allow the floristic cycle to happen, that are sustainable, and enriching the biodiversity of a particular place. These are called agdals or tagdals.
So the simplest explanation of agdals is that people are not allowed to access these areas. I'm talking about this nomadic grazing people. They are not allowed to access these areas until the plants finish the floraison season and the seeds are already on the ground. So we ensure next year we will have this plant again. Then they are allowed to come and graze on these areas for a certain time only. And our research focus is to embrace these cultural practices and these techniques and to highlight the role of agdals on plant conservation with new techniques and new ecological senses.
Les pratiques culturelles les plus importantes pour Aït Mohamed, de mon point de vue, c'est les agdals et Agharman, pour plusieurs raisons. Premièrement, ces pratiques constituent un patrimoine et un héritage culturel et historique de cette tribu. Deuxièmement, ces pratiques, c'est vraiment un modèle de gestion ingénieure des ressources naturelles, surtout en termes de l'eau et de forage, surtout pour la pratique des agdals. Et enfin, ces pratiques jouent un rôle primordial de la conservation du paysage et de la biodiversité.
So for the future, our next step is to continue documenting these practices that we have already studied and map them into a map of the region so we know the spatial distribution of these practices.
What we aim is to be able to propose a protocol for plant conservation that includes the community, and we will try to assess the practices themselves being beneficial or not for plant conservation in order to be able to strengthen those that are positive and maybe propose changes for those that are not.
It's been really interesting to work in a multicultural and multilinguistic team. I feel really enriched through this process, and I've learned a lot as well about the reality in the High Atlas, the amazing traditions that they have that are lost in Europe, some of them.
Well, I like most that I'm learning a lot of things about the cultural practices of conservation in the region. So I find that it's very useful, the work we're doing, especially because some of the information is being lost. Some of the words in Amazigh, for example, are also being forgotten. So it's a very important part of this project is to document them so we know what there is and we can act in the future to avoid bad habits or things that are occurring in these ecosystems that are not healthy for the environment or for the communities.